yeah. Constance? Or yeah, we also need some notes. No, but I think it's very, very, very basic to be strong. You have before slides. You need to do it. Can you make it?
Yeah, no, straight.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, you were really consolidating. Yeah, I think that's. But so far, all the presentations are, I think, so clear. It's that, yeah, can use some thought. That's also. We have recordings as well, so I think we're good. Not everybody's here yet, but I would propose we just start, right? So, hold on. Hello, hello. I think we're almost all here. So yeah, welcome again. Great that you're here. It's day 2. Today is about impacts, climate impacts, and yeah, everything that goes with this adaptation as well, of course. And yeah, so we will kick off today. We have actually a few people that weren't there yesterday, and they will introduce themselves as well. First of all, I think Kai. Yeah, please say who you are.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Kai, and I'm very good to see you all. Some familiar faces and some new faces, so great to see such a diverse group here. I work here at Utrecht University as an assistant professor in climate modeling and also more like the cost-benefit work, so looking at economic impacts of climate change, benefits of mitigations, doing some modeling of that. I developed a Mimosa model that you will use in the workshop just after these 2 talks and also in the afternoon. But we'll come to that at when we do the workshop. And today I'll talk a little bit about economic impacts of climate change. Yeah, I have a background in mathematics. So when I started in the climate field, I just knew nothing about climate, but something about mathematics, and now I start to catch up in the climate field.
And now it's an authority, basically, climate impacts. Oh, really? Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot. We also have a few colleagues, actually. Now, maybe first, Constance. We all really love the food until so far, and I think that will remain the way. So that was due to Constance, but in principle, we organized this summer school together. So maybe you can say something about yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Meet. I'm a PhD at Utrecht University, also working in the English group, and I'm focusing on the critical mineral for the energy transition, sort of scarcities, but later hopefully also environmental impacts. Yeah. I'm thinking of all the cat, and I'm in the postdoc in the image group. I'm looking at how to develop some new technologies and how we can that as well.
Thanks a lot. Oh, Marina is calling, who is the next presenter. I think she doesn't know the door. Hello?
Yes.
You can't open the door or no? Oh, no. So in the room, if you want, it's 003. Oh, the address is 15A. So it's it's number 3 we're now in. Yeah. At the ground floor. Yeah. See a bit. Kai is looking for you. All right. Yeah, it's good when she's here because yeah, she also needs to say a few useful things. All right. Then I think I will also kick off. So it's actually not so useful to you. So we have enough time. So.
I'm there.
Yeah, very good. Hello. Okay, then I think the floor is yours, Kai.
Oh yeah. So let's start. So today we first have 2 lectures. One is about the climate impacts and one is about adaptation, and I think they go hand in hand. And I'll start this talk with a very brief overview of how to calculate, what are the impacts of climate change, how to calculate them in an economic way. For some of you, this might be very basic and common knowledge. For others, it might be useful, but I think it's good to have like this common ground. One thing though, in the workshop, you will work with this a bit more hands-on, because at the end of today, what I want you all to have is like to have a common idea of how big climate impacts are, how much it costs, how much it actually costs to reduce climate change, how much it costs to do mitigation, just to have a feeling of how big these numbers are and how they compare to each other. Because I think that's just something that many people have a sense about in vague terms, but not in actual numbers. And I think it's important that we, and actually everyone, should have some idea of how big these impacts are. All right, so if you want to model the damages of climate change, you first have to think of that. In what aspect does climate change impact our lives? Now, you all know this probably better than I do, but there's many impacts, and I've already seen a few here that are where some of you are actually the experts in. So talking about heat stress, Najeli is expert on this. There's mosquitoes and other diseases, vector-borne diseases. Air pollution is not directly due to climate change, but of course due to the facts that cause climate change. Yield losses, droughts, marine biodiversity impacts, more droughts, floodings from riverine floodings, sea level rise and associated tropical cyclones, forest fires, biodiversity losses, migration, conflicts that also erupt due to climate change, and impact of climate change on electricity production. So you can imagine that there are different wind patterns for your wind turbines, or that there's recently, like we saw in France, that nuclear power plants had to be shut down because there's not enough water to cool it. All these impacts you have to take that into account. So that's kind of the general idea. So we know from all these different impacts that climate change is happening. But how do they compare to each other? How do they actually impact our society? And if you look at the IPCC report, basically all of these have a separate chapter. And there are many people who are expert on one of these topics. But what I actually try to do is combine all of these impacts into what does it impact on the economic level? So if you combine all of them, and you want to know what the economic impacts are, so what is it in terms of dollars or euros, then you already see that there's two types of impacts. You see what we have, the market impacts and the non-market impacts. And you can imagine that, for example, looking at riverine flooding is rather easy to quantify. It's rather easy to say, okay, how much does it cost if this river floods twice a year? You see that there are buildings that get destroyed, infrastructure that gets impacted. There's a few other things, but that's something that you can put some money tag on. But it becomes much harder, for example, on biodiversity loss. How much does it cost if there's a 10% decrease of biodiversity? I don't know. For health, how much does it cost if there's more heat waves? You can think of it in terms of healthcare costs, but also how much does it cost if people die from climate change? And then you get in a much more ethical discussion, like what is a life worth? And there's economists who have kind of developed a methodology to put the price on a life. It's called the statistical value of life, which I personally have quite some difficulties with, because it just expresses the value of a life in terms of certain percentage of basically your GDP in a country. And this means that the life of someone in Africa would be less euros than the life of someone in the Netherlands, which is completely ridiculous, of course. So it's very difficult to put that in terms of monetary impact. So that's why we in our previous studies, we've kind of just ignored this. And there's a few ways that you can deal with it. So what we try to do is always express like so many people would be at risk of dying, but we don't put a monetary tag on it. right? So that's why we focus on these market damages, just because they're easier and there's not these difficult ethical discussions around it. But please keep in mind that these impacts are still very important, and that when you express something to policymakers, like how bad is climate change, you should always say, okay, this in terms of dollars, but there's more than that. There's also these non-market impacts like losses of biodiversity, conflicts, all these kind of things. All right, still with me. So what we now do in our study, and then I'll have a look at the literature a bit more broadly. What you can do is for each of these sectors, you can ask like who are the experts on this topic. For example, other people who work on yields or agriculture here. Okay, great, thanks. So what we did in the study, we asked, and we'd have asked you, like, can you please model what the impacts are of climate change on agriculture? And then you would probably give me something like the yields of maize declined by 10%, or the yields of some other crop declined by 15%, and that's something that you could give me. Then what we did is we took that information, we put it into an economic model called the CGE, and that economic model transforms these yield losses into dollars. So what is the effect on the economy? You can imagine that the yield losses make food prices go up, which in turn has some impact on the economy. There's less growth, or it just costs more to buy stuff. And so that's how we translate yield losses into dollars or euros. Then we look at another sector. Then there's some people working on flooding. Other people working on floods or sea level rise. Not in this, well, that's okay. But then we just ask the expert, like, can you run your sea level rise model and tell me how much meters of sea level rise there is, how often a certain storm occurs, how often a certain river starts flooding, and then we put also that into this model and we get some euros. We do the same for all these market damages, and then what you end up with is a total of the economic impacts of climate change. Now that's one way of doing it, and that's actually the oldest way of doing it. So I don't know if you know William Nordhaus. He made the DICE model. He got the Nobel Prize for the very first IAM, actually. So I'm sure you're all familiar. But he's also getting criticized for his economic damage functions because they're often on the low side. But what he did is exactly this way. So he looks at a certain sector, he thought of it himself, or he asked some experts, like, what do you think are the economic impacts of this sector? He adds it all up, and when you add all these sectors up, you get a certain damage function. And so that's actually something that works great, except that he did this in 1990, and it hasn't really been updated since then. So these DICE damage functions are very outdated, but the principles, I think, are still very intact. We updated this like 2 years ago, and I'll show some results in a minute. But that's like one way of doing it. That's what we call the bottom-up approach. You look at the sectors, you add them all up, and you get some economic impact. Another way, this we talked, the non-market damages are just difficult to quantify. We can have a discussion about this, by the way. We're actually doing this now also, but I'm going to skip that.
Maybe one
yes.
Fun fact, maybe. You had a discussion with him during your defense, right? Or
Yes. So when I defended my PhD, William Nordhaus was in the opposition, which was very stressful for me, but also very cool. Yeah, that was... Yes, I somehow I did. Yeah. Maybe it's because he was still in the US and there wasn't some physical. Yes, exactly. So the other way is looking at empirical studies, and that's more the top-down approach. So it's a completely different way of valuing the impacts of climate change. And what you can do, you look at historical weather patterns in different countries. So we have the daily weather from the past 10, 20, 30 years. And then you can also look at the daily economic output in those countries. there's a lot of data on economic production, on local GDP, based on which is based on daily weather. So you can kind of correlate how does the increase or decrease in temperature relate to economic output. And it gives like a very empirical way of getting impacts of climate change. And the most famous study for this was by Marshall Burke and colleagues, but these are the Burke functions, and there have been many updates since. This is from like 2015, I think. That's like the key study. And what they did is they found a relationship between, on the x-axis would be local temperature, so not global temperature, but local temperature. And on the y-axis would be your change in GDP, so basically how much it costs. And you see the typical U-shape or inverted U-shape, where if you're on the left, so if it's very cold in your region and then it becomes hotter, then you see your economic output increases. So you can imagine that if it's very cold and it warms up, then you have more agriculture, you can do a bit more, and it's all positive. But if you're in a very hot country, for example, Brazil, Indonesia, then if it becomes hotter, then you lose economic output. Because it becomes too hot, you lose terms of labor productivity, you have more impacts. So you have this very nice inverted U shape, which you can apply for also for the future. So what you do, you take this U shape. You look at, okay, this is where we currently are. In the future, if it's 2 degrees warmer, we probably shift up over here. And then you see for each country what the impacts are. So that's a very different way of looking at than the sectoral approach. And maybe I kind of want to go into a bit of discussion with you, like, so imagine that you have to present this, or that you're a policymaker. Which method do you prefer? What would be the pros and cons of the methods? So we've got this bottom-up approach, sectoral, we look at sectoral models and then aggregate it, and you've got this top-down, this empirical. So yes, please.
And where you do the bottom-up, you can distinguish different impacts. So it might be easier for you to understand, like, oh, we have lost an agricultural risk, loss of income, for example.
Yeah.
So for a policymaker, it might be easier to address those problems, whereas with this approach, you can put everything in one bucket and it's really hard to distinguish where the losses are coming from. I also wonder what indirect biases might be in there, because maybe countries with a similar climate are in similar locations, so you might have bias from that I don't know what you can control.
Yeah, so for your first point, I think it's very, very valid that you can't disaggregate the different sources of damages. And then on your second point, I won't go too much into the details, but yes, there are some biases in there, but they've done a lot of statistical analysis to kind of get rid of most of these biases in there. So they have a few other regression terms to try to get rid of, to try to really go into the actual impacts of climate change and not the socioeconomic impacts or all these kinds of things. So they tried to get rid of it. In the 2015 paper, that was still a beginning, but in the recent developments, there has been quite some developments there. Yes. Yes, yes. So that is great, actually, that you say that. So you can also make these functions on a sectoral level. And then you kind of address your first point, that you also can see what the different sectoral impacts are from an empirical way. So that is indeed possible. It is a bit harder because you need, like, there's more data on aggregate GDP output than on sectoral GDP output, sectoral economic output, but it is definitely possible. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
I just want to ask, what is about non-market damages in empirical approaches? Are they somehow inside, or like?
Yeah, it's difficult to say what is exactly in there. Usually they're not in there, but you can imagine some secondary effects that are in there. So if biodiversity losses, for example. It's very hard to model what the impacts are biodiversity losses on the economy, but maybe we've already felt it over the past 20 years, and that would be incorporated in this function and not in the first approach. So indirectly, it could be in there. It's just not very transparent. Yes, please.
You might have some impacts which are like, as you said, like transported across space, but also across time. So maybe we see the impacts of what is happening today in like 10 years because of supply chains or whatever. So this kind of assumes that you have on the same day the production output as the like temperature, production changes, whatever. But if we have, I don't know, some impacts which are further down the pipeline, we wouldn't be able to see that.
Yes, that's true. But you can then introduce a statistical lag term that you correlated not to the temperature at time t, but at time t minus 5, minus 10. So then you could address that. That's true. That's true. Yeah. So that would be more difficult. Yeah. Other. Yes.
So one downside of the bottom-up approach is that you still need damage functions for each CGE, but then they're like much more hidden in the process and less transparent maybe than if you have one overall one that you can somewhat understand.
Yeah. So if we go back, and I think this is very important. I kind of hit it here. There's these little gears here that I kind of skipped over. I said, yeah, that's a CGE, so don't worry about it. And that's kind of a problem. And that's also, in my view, the biggest problem with this approach is that right now, how to translate these 10% losses from maize yields, how do you translate that into economic impacts? You have to put it into some kind of CGE. And right now, we used the ISIS model, which is from colleagues in Venice. But that's a very, it's not a transparent way. We are currently trying to make it much more transparent, to make it kind of simple relationship for each sector, how to kind of skip this step so that you make it very transparent. But that's a big downside. And you also kind of get rid of some, it's a CGE stands for computable general equilibrium. So it stands for equilibrium. It kind of assumes a perfect economy where you've got trade, and if one impact on one sector, then it's kind of taken up by another sector, and that kind of dampens all your impacts. So we were skeptical. Turns out it worked out quite okay, but it's still a downside. Yes.
Even though the money is more than also doing work.
Yeah, that's true. But all these the damage functions that derive from this one, they are, and that's kind of an advantage of this method. They're regional, so you've got your regional impacts from your region. So if 100 euros get destroyed in the Netherlands, would be different than 100 euros getting destroyed in a poorer country. So if you build them using data from that country and you apply that in that country, then it's still fine. And once you start aggregating it, then you start thinking, okay, how do you aggregate it? That's a different story. But these damage functions are regional, so that kind of tackles that problem.
So corrected for power purchasing power.
Exactly. Then that would be in the GDP PPP. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe that's my next slide. Now I will actually skip this and go directly here. So this is kind of a literature comparison of what is currently out there. It's a little bit outdated, but it's not. It won't dramatically change. So let's go to the blue dots. Those are all the different runs of the CGE in our bottom-up approach. So you can imagine that we ran this CGE with a lot of scenarios, a lot of RCP-SSP combinations, but also for a lot of different time steps, for a lot of different assumptions of each sector. We asked them, can you do low impacts, medium impacts, high impacts? And it gives you a lot of uncertainty. And each of these points represent one of these time steps in a CGE. And what we did is we just fitted some quadratic curves through that. So we've got your median line, which is your pink line here. We've got the two yellow lines, which are the uncertainty ranges. So this is kind of the fifth percentile. So 5% of the points are below this line. This is the 95th percentile. So 95% of the points are below that line. And interestingly, the median line of our study corresponds quite exactly with the kind of medium line in the current literature from 5 years ago, which is the Howard et al. They did a meta-analysis which kind of combined these old ways of thinking with the new ways of these empirical ones, and they got kind of the same there.
I guess Howard was quite happy with that.
Yes, Howard was a reviewer of this paper. So.
Oh, okay. That also helps.
Yeah, that helps. And the Berg one. So the Berg one has two ways. So one is called the short run and the long run. And kind of the short run was very close to this line, but the long run was really the high end of the damages. It kind of corresponded very well with our high end of our damages. So we were very surprised by this, that these impacts are actually so similar. We did not expect it. We actually expected our damages to be much lower because we put them through the CGE, which kind of dampens all the impacts. And we knew that we were underestimating all the damages. We didn't take into account biodiversity losses, no tipping points, no health impacts, because we thought that was difficult. But even if you do that, you already get the same level of damages there. All right.
So let alone, I mean, if you do include those.
If you do include those, it will be much higher as well.
So don't underestimate climate change. So.
No. And the message here, and that's something that you will investigate in the workshop, is climate change has a high economic impact. We all know that climate change is bad, right? But this shows what the economic impacts are of climate change. And if you look at the y-axis, it's in terms of GDP loss. So how much lower is the GDP due to climate change? And if we're thinking about 5% or 10%, it doesn't sound like that much, but actually it's a big deal. So if you look at, so what is GDP? In the Netherlands, for example, we have the budget of the government. What is the government spending? And it's roughly equal to half of the GDP. And so if you think that, so 10% of your GDP would be 20% of your government output in terms of money. 20% of your government spending is probably in Netherlands like something like everything on healthcare. And that's a huge amount of money. So we're talking about big numbers. And this is something that policymakers find very important, and because they just like numbers, they find it easier to deal with. Yes.
Just one question related to GDP. Is it always like yearly GDP loss? And by growth, it's not accounted, like it's just the loss and then there's some growth, but it's per year.
Yeah, so growth is taken into account in our model, but this is simply looking at yearly losses. So what would be in that year the loss from climate change? And if you are 10% lower, then your growth is also lower. So your impacts on the next step will also be slightly lower. So there's some indirect effects there, but this is just your yearly impacts, your direct impacts, what we call it.
So 8% next year, not 8%, so it also would be decreasing time.
No, your 8% would still the same if your temperature stays the same, but your GDP would then grow less fast because you start with you have a lower GDP due to climate change, which means that you have lower capital, which means that you have lower investments, which means you have lower GDP in the next step. So there's also lower growth there. Yes.
So these points do not refer to the same year.
No, because on the x-axis you've got temperature. So you probably one of these lines are sometimes a bit connected, and you get probably from the same run, but then from different time steps.
Okay. And you compare case with no climate change and no climate policy, right?
Yes. Yes, this is purely the effects of climate change. And what we then do is, maybe I've got a plot somewhere. Here I show what the impacts are for 3-degree worlds from different regions. And the different bars represent different integrated assessment models that we put it into, just for some sensitivity there. And but what I want to show is that these different colors. So there's the dark blue. You can't see it well on the screen, but there's dark blue, there's just normal blue and light blue. Dark blue are the impacts from temperature-related climate change. Medium blue are from sea level rise only, because they separated those. And the other one, which is related to this, is the indirect damages, which are due to your less growth. So you can imagine that if you grow less, then that's kind of also an effect that you have to take into account. And that's what they call indirect damages. And these direct damages come from the damage functions. These indirect damages come from less growth due to these impacts.
From Jan or no?
But you first had a question, yeah.
Seems being really different. This would be a function in the European assumption.
Yes, true, but the problem with these empirical damage functions, which I find always difficult, is they're based on historical realizations. And historically, we haven't seen big impacts on the scale that was never shown before, kind of by definition. Which is something that you can actually model. So in the sectoral models, you can just take, I'm always pointing at you because you're doing the agriculture modeling here, but you can take an agriculture model and then include a climate run which has a lot of tipping points in there. And then you can see what would happen if climate would have these tipping points. So you can actually model it, and that you can put into the CGE. And then maybe economically some things are kind of dampened, but that's a different thing. But from a climate perspective, you can put tipping points in there. In an empirical approach, it becomes more difficult. So it has more flexibility. And Jan, yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, so the present figure you're giving is competitive baseline, right? It's not a year-to-year loss, the fact isn't. So if your GDP without climate change, it would have doubled, then instead it would only grow by 90%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so do you know how much it still increase or decrease in total over the period?
The GDP?
Yeah.
Yes. It still increases substantially. And maybe for all the rest, it's also something that I want you to have a look at during the workshop after this. It's important to know what the impacts are of climate change, but still also have a look at one of these variables is just the GDP, and you will still see GDP increasing. Of course, it won't increase as much, but it's still important to realize also the GDP per capita is still increasing in the SSP2 world. And even the SSP3 world is still increasing. So that's important to keep in mind. That's yes.
So basically for both approaches, we have time. So
Okay. Yeah.
I'm relatively quick and think perfect. But so how much adaptation is in there? So you said sea level rise, but I could imagine there's a bit in both, in a way that you would always expect some adaptation. In the empirical results, you would, I think, definitely also expect some. So that's quite unclear, right? Or what do you know?
Yeah, so I hope no one would ask this question because it's a difficult question. And no, it's important. First of all, for the bottom-up approach, it's relatively easy because you can just ask all the impact models, do you have adaptation in there or not? And somehow we didn't ask when we made those functions, so we don't know. This is true. We just don't know if there's adaptation in there or not. We think probably not, but we're not sure. And in the new project that's running right now, we are doing this better with adaptation, and we're asking all the models explicitly, can you run with low adaptation, with high adaptation? What is the effectiveness of your adaptation? What are the adaptation costs? And all these things, so you can model them bottom up, and it becomes much more transparent. But it's also difficult. It's an extra exercise for the modeling teams. Like for each modeling team should then have an idea of what adaptation would be in their sector. For sea level rise, it's easy. That's why we did it for sea level rise and not for the others. For sea level rise, you can just say, do we keep the dikes as they are, or do we just raise them, roughly speaking? So that's easy. For the others, it becomes a bit more difficult. Yes.
Yeah, if you can go back to the map that you showed. Yeah, and this mostly because you have the direct and the indirect growth effect. And now, so we did not coordinate our presentations because yesterday I basically told the people exactly the opposite.
See, you should have been at our coordination meetings, Nico.
Yeah, at the time. So
There's no better way to show uncertainty. So it's quite good.
So the growth effect and, in the empirical approach, the paper by Max Kotz and IAMs, we have these huge lag structure, yeah, that accumulates the damages or the differences in GDP, the GDP response in the end. And this has allegedly to do with distortions in the market and crowding out of capital investments and so on. What are the growth effects, the indirect effects that you consider here in this CGE-based approach? Because I could imagine that either you account for the direct effects, what in Leonie's estimation is the growth, the lag effect, and that you are missing some of the indirect effects. So
Yeah, so I know that there's a big discussion in the literature about growth versus level effects. But if we look at this one, actually the Berg long range has it's very similar to the Kotz and Wentz damage function, where they also actually the Berg one is. The empirical ones are a growth impact. So what is the impact on growth and not on GDP? But I don't see this big difference between the two because mathematically you can always express one in terms of the other. And if you just do this whole, it's kind of an iterative process to get there, but you can express one in terms of the other. And then you get these impacts, which are, so these are based on the growth impacts. But if you transform them into a level GDP impact, then you get something that looks like this one. So yeah, it is being taken into account. And I think in our approach, there's two ways that it's taken into account, because in the sectoral impacts, you have these impacts getting worse. In the CGE, there's probably some kind of less growth to in the next time step. And then we do that extra into our IAM, which has a Cobb-Douglas module, which just says that you have certain GDP, and then you take part of that goes to investments, and that will lead to more capital in the next step. And that's where our indirect impacts come from, is that you have less investments, so less capital, so there's also less GDP to start with in the next step before you apply this damage function again in the next step.
Last question.
Yeah.
You when you then project your impacts on scenarios, you don't explicitly account for damage resistance, right? Because that's what that paper does. So I think that's the difference. They explicitly account for the fact that the 1 year's damages last for several years.
Yeah, they do. But as I said, you can express one in terms of the other.
Yeah.
And you can just either do that and just increase, do this one and just make it slightly higher, or just have these lag effects. And the shape becomes slightly nonlinear and becomes a little bit different. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter so much. Anyway, I think we got to move on. This also, I will probably just stop here. One thing though that I want to mention, this is something that you will explore more in depth in the workshop, is that there's two ways of looking at economic impacts. There's a positive and a negative way. The negative way is you can say, wow, these impacts are very large. Climate change is very bad. And our paper just would have said, climate impacts are worse than we thought. Then that's one way of looking at it. The way we phrased it was exactly the same, but the positive way is, oh, there's a lot of potential for benefits. So you can actually reduce, but if you reduce it, you avoid a lot of damages. So that's great. So there's very high benefits. And this somehow worked very well with policymakers. This is something that people from the EU Commission told us, but also in the US, that this is something you phrase it in a positive way. You're saying exactly the same. Either you say this is getting worse, or we can avoid a lot. But that helped very, very well. And these kind of benefit cost ratios is something that you also explore, because those are just facts that you can use at the party and say, oh, I don't know what party you go to, but parts I go to, I can say, wow, the benefits of mitigation are 4 times larger than the costs of mitigation. So yay, let's do it. All right, that was, I will skip all this, and there was a whole part about adaptation that Marina will talk about, so that's great. Mathijs.
Thanks a lot, though.
Yeah.
It's also the factual way, like it's the positive way, but it's also what's really happening. People don't realize that they would really benefit from doing something. So
They would, yeah.
okay, this is something completely different. Marina, I'll try to be as quick as possible. But I will be a bit later, but I think we. How much time do you need?
I have like 200 slides or something.
Okay. All right. So I thought this was also nice. I will show 2 things that we have been working on that could be just interesting. Also, for your information a little bit. One is the survey we've done. That is a survey that's quite recent within the PRISMA project. We've done a survey or we sent it out to 101 IAM teams. I didn't know there were so many IAMs. So there is actually more if you count national ones. So there are a few national ones in there, but a lot anyway. And we got responses from 41. So and those are all the main IAMs. So I'm already quite happy with what we have, but I'll also point out, I think, a few things that could still be improved. Then the other thing is some results from a study from Navigate. That was the predecessor of PRISMA, where we also looked at model improvement and where we tried to put as many impacts in image. So that's a good example of what you can do, I think, with IAM. So that might also be useful if you go a bit in the sort of the impact direction with your work, for instance, or with the workshop. So in first survey, we call it Understanding the Representation of Climate Impacts and Adaptation in Integrated Assessment Models. And just maybe some background. So I think lots of this has been said also by Detlef. In general, mitigation in IAMs is of course well represented. It's basically a bread and butter. But climate impacts typically less. Now, looking at the results, maybe you could say it is getting more and more. And then, so why do we want to do this? So if you look at the climate impact models, they are, of course, very good in trying to understand, that's what they do, trying to understand the impacts in sectors. But there's less interaction. They're not really that integrated. It's usually a team looking at a specific impact. Then you have the cost benefits IAMs that integrate mitigation, adaptation impacts and have a full economic picture. But it's stylized, it's simple, like the DICE model, and I mean Moses has also a shit model. No, just no, but it's of course but it's stylized, and you miss lots of the processes below it, and also based on older data. Generally, if you look at the older cost benefit analysis IAMs, and then if you look at the process IAMs, like the bigger ones, like image, like message, or Remind Magpie, there's lots of them. Generally, they didn't or don't include impacts adaptation in assessments. In that paper, Nicole van Manen et al., we tried to make some suggestions of how can you introduce more adaptation, but basically also impacts in these models. So what the reasons for this this assessment was like to kind of create an overview, first of all, to avoid inconsistencies in scenario analysis, also what Detlef explained, that you have these different groups, working group 1, 2, 3, and then you can have double counting. If already impacts are in the model, then the impact group might count that again. And also, we also want to sort of have entry points based on this from how can we improve these models. So what's not in there, but where is the information now, for instance, in the impact community, and how can we benefit from that? So that's actually what I already said, I think. And we also want to look at feedbacks in the models. So this is also what I said. The models that we got for results from 41 teams, but we'll also show a table with 17 teams. I did this a bit earlier. So it will be difficult to have a sort of a structured overview of all these results at some point. Yeah, this just shows the impacts. And it seems like there's quite a lot of climate impacts in IAMs. So these are the different categories. And then the blue one is basically an impact that also has feedbacks in the model and sort of, yeah, is in that sense completely integrated. One way is basically only output. So it's light blue. And then the green is planned or possible. So yeah, that for me, that doesn't really count. It's just the way we, the way we in image is something we can basically model. But I think for lots of teams, it's just, yeah, we would like to do that. But yeah. And then I think it's not in there. But still, it's sort of half of the, seems like half of the impacts are in there. And then you see that economy is well represented, energy very well as well. Then land, water a bit less, and then we also have extreme events, and then governments kind of things. Those are, yeah, difficult to represent. And this is adaptation, sort of half. Yeah, you need to have the impacts first, and then you can also have adaptation in there. And that's a bit less, and that's expected. And then I try to have a first look at what kind of things are represented. So you can say, yeah, we have this category, but then it can be just one aspect of it. So yeah, the economic effects, the GDP, labor productivity kind of things. But that energy supply, for instance, in terms of impacts, renewables is in there. So one of my colleagues, David Gernaert, he did some assessment there, and that's something that all teams can apply. But what you see less is the nuclear power plants, as you mentioned, I think, Kai. And yeah, same for power plants in general when water is there. That's something that I haven't seen much in models, but it can be modeled. So yeah, for all these different categories, there's only partial representation. And also this basically says when you have impacts, this side we also have adaptation. This also shows that people give some bogus answers, because if, yeah, impacts no, but adaptation yes, in some cases. Yeah, I don't think that's possible. So yeah, I don't really trust all of the answers, but it gives a bit of an image. But yeah, so it's about half, like I showed in the other graph, the representation of adaptation compared to impacts. But some are actually more. So sea level rise is indeed more. That fits well with what Kai showed. But for instance, biodiversity, almost zero. Yeah, you can adapt in principle and increase biodiversity if yeah, basically by land protection. But right. And yeah, when adaptation is in there, that's also a bit what I know, not exactly what we asked, but a bit what we got back was it's usually sort of, yeah, very bipolar in the sense that it's either full adaptation usually, so you have impacts but you sort of discount them, or you have no adaptation. You fully get these impacts, at least in the process IAMs mostly. This is just to give a bit of an idea. We try to structure it a bit. So we are thinking about, still very work in progress, structuring models sort of more towards biophysical representation, more economic representation. We're looking at, is it also biophysically modeled, so there's the process in there, or is it in a monetary way? So this is a bit odd because you also have quite a lot of biophysical in the bottom, while it's economic. And yeah, we look at if it's if you have these full feedbacks in the, like I showed before, and if it's optional or if it's just post-processing / output kind of thing. So just to give you an idea. And this is then adaptation. What we also want to know is there maladaptation? And it's not always the right term, but that means in this case, the way I would phrase it is, does adaptation also have further impacts? Does it sort of, yeah, also have feedback within the model? So yeah, typically for if you have more air conditioning, you also need more energy. Or if you have more desalination, you have waste and more energy and water loss, those kind of things. There might be actually synergies, but it's usually a negative effect. Also, model clustering. This, I have to be honest, I don't know exactly how Francesco, our CC colleague, did this, but he tried to cluster models in sort of a narrative, basically. So first one, models that really focus on the economy. So you see that they give answers which are very much related to labor productivity and economic impacts. It's all about power. Economy and superstructure is all about power, so like energy stuff related. And then a jack of many trades. So yeah, basically doing everything. But how he exactly put a model in a certain category, I don't know exactly. But this is in principle interesting, I think. And then he tried to look at how the different models fall in these different categories. And it's, I think, very much what you would expect. So really the bit more than what I showed in the last table. So really the economic models, yeah, of course say something about economic impacts, and the energy models, of course, say a lot about energy. So, but I think that we still need to think about this a bit, but it makes sense. So consistent answers in that sense. So a few conclusions, and so for the coverage is very well for energy and for economy, and a bit less for land and water. Adaptation is roughly, yeah, represents in half the cases, when then often binary. And then, yeah, so we have to realize that there are implicit impacts and adaptation in scenarios, in the SSPs, for instance, or in scenario MIP, which might be double counted and I think need to be mapped more better. And then, yeah, like I said, the flattered results, we really, as a next step, want to know what kind of impacts or adaptation mechanisms are you really modeling, and not just saying, yeah, we have got this category covered, because they don't probably. We just really want to know what you're doing. But there will be a lot of work because, yeah, so many models. Okay, and then I'll move to the next thing. I'll try to be really quick. This is a paper that's almost published. We did, yeah, like I said, in Navigate, where we try to put as many impacts in image as possible. And some of them were already in there, but yeah, we made, yeah, we put some more in there. So I'm actually doing the same thing as my complaint just now. We got heating and cooling in there, so energy demands, renewable energy supply, power plant cooling a little bit, and agricultural land, for instance, that is actually modeled quite detailed in the image, just how land changes because of climate change, also because of extra CO2 fertilization. And then adaptation is also in there in the sense that farmers will find the optimal spot. So they actually see their land disappearing and then they go to an optimal place. And then water for agriculture, adaptation is there in the sense that we always try to sort of have consistent water demand. Yeah, and also water, for instance, in the residential and industry sector. Sea level rise is just an output. Biodiversity is just an output, and health impacts are partially covered and also just an output. Yeah. Yeah, and I think Jonathan Doelman knows this better, but I think it's half the affected LPGA ML spits out, because that was extreme. Yeah, but it is in there. Yeah. So and it has a big impact as well.
Yeah.
This is one plot that Detlef also showed. So the blue arrows are model linkages, but we want to close the loop, as he mentioned it, and also have climate feedbacks in there in a consistent way. So maybe, yeah, easy is then sort of labor productivity GDP. Image is a simulation model, so it's not an economic model. So we have a very simple representation of economic growth, basically as input files. But that's easy in this case. So we can sort of already count for, yeah, we run the model first and then or think about it sort of exogenously and then put it into the model, having lower GDP growth. We have less energy demands because of more energy demands because of cooling, less because of less heating, but it's more. Constance actually knows everything about this, if you want to know. And also yields are impacted. biochemical cycles, that's a bit more complex with the sense that we have then different precipitation and temperature patterns, but also land cover is impacted because you have of course the different natural areas, but also agriculture, and that again also influences biochemical cycles and CO2 indeed. So yeah, just to give you an idea. Yeah, this I'll skip. And what we did is basically have scenarios with and without impacts. So we try to do it in a systematic way. Yeah, I think this really sort of echoes what you were already saying. So what we see is, or this we did then, or Kai actually exogenously, that you have higher effects in warm regions. Also because what you said, like it is already hot, and also what that have said, labor productivity there is also easier affected because there's more outside labor force. And crop yields, again, same story, more impacts in tropical regions. And what is important to realize here, and I think that's sort of general comment, we don't include climate extremes. So it could be completely different if you have the way Detlef explains it. If there would be a big drought, then yeah, plants stop growing. But then after 2 weeks, like in real life, they would be dead, but they just grow again. So the impacts would be much bigger if we would include that. Yeah, biodiversity, this is just an example, I think skip as well. And then again, yeah, sorry.
Ask you about
Yeah, sorry, I won't skip it.
So, this project, how do you account for biodiversity? I mean, you account for biodiversity loss, or do you account for economic loss related to biodiversity?
No, it's mostly biodiversity loss. It is the mean species abundance. That is a indicator in the GloBio model, which is connected to image. This was actually from an emulator that sort of mimics GloBio quite well. But I think the way I don't know exactly what the formula is, but it is very close to really biodiversity loss, I think. If you're nodding.
Included in terms of economic loss, that's more difficult. We have now a master student that we work on that, and there's also a degree dice and all these kind of things. You know, look at ecosystem services and what are how much smaller are the ecosystem services, how much money does each ecosystem service bring, and you multiply it to really get the economic impact. But it's it's difficult. It's really in the starting blocks.
Yeah, so it's definitely not economic impacts, but it meant like the mean species abundance is close to biodiversity loss, but it's not exactly the same. So that I don't know exactly. And this was for plants. It's a bit difficult to do it for vertebrates, but it is only due to climate. So there's lots of factors impacting biodiversity, of course. Yeah, and these are just to give you, these are all the biggest country in the biggest image regions. So it just basically gives an idea of the main areas in the world, from cold to hot. And yeah, so this is again the same message that impacts generally correlates, that you have hot regions are also impact hotspots. And then water and biodiversity doesn't have that, at least in our results. And also we did this with 2 climate models. So we had IPSL, which was already used in image in some cases, but now then, for all of the different impacts. And we did the same for Hadley, where the results were quite similar. And this is then for a 2-degree scenario, basically, where you see the same pattern, but then, much smaller effects. I think almost last slide, almost. This shows a scenario with and without GDP impacts. So that's also what we did, because we already expected that GDP can dominate really the results. That's partly true. So in general, so with all impacts included, so also with GDP, those are the blue lines. And in most cases here, especially, you see that you have a bit larger impacts with GDP included. But okay, I think generally it can also be the other way around, or very similar. But obviously, economic impacts dominate where differences in human activities are involved. So if the GDP of a certain region or globally is lower, you also expect less energy use and also less emissions due to that. And that really dominates those results. So this is non-biorenewable energy, final energy, and also greenhouse gases at the bottom, obviously. That's much more important, but for all the other ones, it's either not so important or even the other way around. So not in this overview, I think, but I think you see the same results as with final engine. Because this is a baseline, I think for 2 degree scenario, I think it was similar to final engine. Here in the baseline, and for 2 degree scenario, I think we used the same carbon price to sort of get the right results out, and then also had less, the same story. But if you have like a set target, obviously you have the same greenhouse gas emission.
The crop yields are hardly affected.
Weirdly enough, I would expect more indeed. But I think it's also because they're sort of target setting there, and you don't want people to starve. And that's actually what you would expect in the real world as well. No, I'm actually wrong. It's probably also because of the finding new, better, optimal places to farm. I think that has something to do with it as well. So there might be areas in the world, of course, which become more, like in Russia or in the become more suitable for farming. I guess
some losses and there's some gains. And
I guess so. Sure. Yeah, sorry, I don't know exactly. I think so. And also the extremes are not included. So I think this could be a different story. With I think I said this. Small effects indeed for crop yields, food consumption, and natural environments, at least in our model. But this was just also to show the principle of including these impacts better in an IAM. This we said as well. So it would be great. There was actually also the ambition at the time to also include adaptation in there, but this eventually turned out to be mostly focused on impacts, and we would like to link that to socio-economic pathways. So is I think a nice bridge to what Melina probably is gonna explain. If you could link this to the SSPs, think about adaptive capacity in different scenarios and different pathways. I think that would be fantastic, but it's also quite challenging. And what we also would like to have is a better consistency between these overall economic impacts and also the sectoral changes and basically the processes that we have with the model. It's easier said than done, but it would be fantastic if we could have some economic output that we could really link to our scenarios. Climate extremes is an important one, but this is the way we also explain in our results. I think this is really a step forward. Also being honest about what's in your model, but also not having it is will be in any case an inconsistent story. So I think we do have a better view of how climate impacts also impact mitigation and then lots of other effects in the model. So I think it was a useful study. And with that, then we have some time. That this was a sort of duo study, or then maybe let's address this question to Nico. So why split Remind and Magpie in the survey? And why not do it together? Do you know that?
I don't know.
It was mentioned in our last call. I think, yeah, they are a bit separate worlds in a way. And maybe they want to be also explicit in what is in these different models. I think that was probably the main reason.
It's like from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
All integration of all impacts through these empirical damage functions that Kai showed. While in Magpie, we have sector-specific impacts, so maybe that's the reason about.
Yeah, it's for us clearer now. So that if it's not in Magpie, economic impacts, then it's good that they mention that in the surveys.
How it's also affecting their model. So I was just curious.
Yeah.
I also understand.
I think that's at least a reason. Yeah. Okay. Any other things? And that's it from my side. You use your laptop?
No.
Or just the presentation is on the yeah.
I uploaded some
Yeah. Okay.
updates, but yesterday, so.
All right. This one, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I had the pleasure of meeting some of you already yesterday evening. For those who I didn't, and we'll meet throughout the week, my name is Marina. I'm based at the Energy, Climate and Environment Program at IASA. IASA is home to the Message Integrated Assessment Model, which may have come up, or it definitely came up yesterday in Detlef's presentation as well, and here in these stock takes. As I already chatted with several of you about, I don't work on Message, I work with people who work on Message. And I'm there in the team trying to sort of bring in adaptation relevant aspects in Message, but during my PhD, I've really been focusing on actually making scenarios useful for adaptation representation or for measuring adaptation relevant aspects. And that's what I'll weave in today, mostly towards the second half of the presentation, because in the beginning, I still want to round this up a little bit, this overview of adaptation still in climate impact models, cost-benefit IAMs, process-based IAMs, but that's already been covered. Then we'll talk about a little bit about the concept of adaptive capacity, how to measure it, and how to represent it in scenarios. And then I'm happy to have a discussion at the end, but also throughout, please feel free to interrupt me. And I actually want to start with a little reflection, a bit triggered by what Mathijs said about IAMs have, of course, been focused on mitigation. And for me, this, of course, mitigation part was a bit surprising when I started working in this field, because I thought adaptation and mitigation are complements. They're both parts of climate action. So I was a bit, until I learned all the complexities involved in it, a bit surprised about the let's say, disproportionate focus on mitigation. But then another thing is, and this, I'm really curious about different perspectives on this, but throughout my short career in this field, I've also observed a bit of a discourse shift in that when I was in my master's, we couldn't talk about adaptation because this would be a distraction from mitigation. Like there was this A word, adaptation, because talking about adaptation would be giving in to the fact that we cannot do enough mitigation. So we don't talk about it, but over time, not least because of mounting climate impacts and sort of inevitability of climate change, it's probably impossible to not talk about adaptation. And concurrently, I think we've also observed increasing efforts to integrate it in all different types of IAMs. And I guess the demand for policy advice also changed a little bit, and it's important to weigh these things carefully. But it's not that it hasn't been thought of, and that's what I want to show here on this overview. Mathijs already mentioned this paper, which provides a nice structured way of thinking about adaptation and all these different tools. So you start with climate impact models. So that's all the different sectoral models that were already mentioned, including econometric climate impact models that Kai mentioned. And on the right side, you have here IAMs, again, split into process-based IAMs,
and cost-benefit IAMs. And don't want to spend too much time on this figure, but just wanted to show sort of for you to have a mind map of how it comes together. And crucially, actually, this part here is this handshake. So how do we actually integrate adaptation in models? Do we integrate it directly? So by representing a specific adaptation option, like here in this crop model, we have irrigation that increases by X%, and then this reduces crop yield loss. Or do we integrate it through an aggregate damage function, which might be more appropriate for what IAMs can actually absorb? And I think that would be another nice point for all of us to discuss what are all the different ways in which it could be integrated. I'll start with climate impact models, because to integrate adaptation or impacts into IAMs, first you need to understand these impacts. And I'll give, as the title of my presentation said, this is a very incomplete overview, but I want to drive home this point of the tendency to oversimplify adaptation and to show it as these two, in a binary notion, as these two extremes. So I think this here figure is a nice example. This comes from the special report on oceans and cryosphere from the IPCC from already a couple of years ago. From the IPCC, meaning that this is already a synthesis of the different studies in this arena. So I'm not showing individual model results, but already the study. And basically here you see risks of sea level rise under different scenarios and for different sort of, not sectors, but different areas affected by sea level rise. And you see a very beloved burning embers diagrams. Here you see basically risks of climate change increasing the higher you go with warming, risks of sea level rise increasing the higher you go with warming. And you're focused now on the small r here. So you see here the disaggregation for the different areas. And then the big R is what happens with the maximum potential response, in this case, meaning adaptation, maximum potential response to sea level rise. And you see how this risk for some areas quite drastically changes. So it goes from high to moderate, or for even in the lower levels of yellow. So it maybe halves your risk, or whatever you can interpret from this figure. I think that's another thing we could discuss. The point being that there is a difference between no response and maximum potential response, while in reality, adaptation is always somewhere in between. And what I want to show today is that the ability for a maximum response is something that could be really present.
What is an atoll island? You think so?
St. Lucia, Marshall Islands, like
Okay.
urbanized small islands.
Okay.
Small island developments.
Yes, that's I had an association.
Urban areas. Yeah.
It's probably included because it has a super large impact, I guess, right? If you have it. Yeah.
I think it's a different way of saying maybe populated islands, but you don't want to say this because they could be populated in different ways, but like so this is IPCC a couple of years ago. Then there is a totally different impact. This is in AR6, in again a synthesis of science, where a little bit more nuance was introduced. So here we again have the same logic, different burning embers, but now with a little bit more nuance to represent limited adaptation, incomplete adaptation, or proactive. So you're anticipating your impacts in advance, and you're investing higher amounts in the health system. And this was done for basically several selected health impacts. Again, it's a bit hard to measure. What is incomplete adaptation? What is limited adaptation? And who and where implements these different levels of adaptation? So it's clear, yes, that this helps to reduce the risk, but we don't know much more than that. And even this figure is thanks to someone from the scenario community who thought it's very useful to think about adaptation in scenario terms. But this was not this is the only risk among the key risks synthesized in the IPCC in this assessment cycle that basically had a bit more nuance about adaptation. So I'm happy if someone chips in to their favorite sectoral impact models. I know, again, a disclaimer that this is largely talking about global models. I know that regional models or local models or really sort of only sectoral zooming into models can represent more nuanced adaptation. But again, here we're talking about global models, and this is largely the picture that you see. So by and large, stylized and rather simplistic. I don't see anyone wanting to jump in. I'm saying this also because I've just covered kind of these two big sectors, but happy to talk about it a little bit more. For the cost-benefit IAMs, this has come through a lot today. I just want to show sort of a way to think about it in a curve way. So for a given level of mitigation or for a given level of climate warming, you can do adaptation that reduces residual damage costs. These costs of adaptation climb. You need to find some sort of a ratio for which this makes sense. This is summed by the total impact costs, and where they are minimum, this is your optimal adaptation. Here, for a given level of adaptation, you can think about the mitigation cost. Again, the cost, the more you mitigate, of course, your total impacts go down, but so does the cost of mitigation. So you again need to find some balance. And basically, here, the total climate costs add mitigation impacts and adaptation costs. And basically here again, you see at the level of optimal adaptation, which is here, you can do a little bit less mitigation than you would have normally with a suboptimal adaptation level. So that's another, from my perspective, problematic bit of cost-benefit IAMs, this trade-off treatment between mitigation and adaptation. And here I tried to summarize it a little bit on this slide. So basically, one can think about them as complementary strategies, as substitute strategies. So only if you do enough adaptation, you can reduce mitigation. Basically what you show on this graph, and this can be a result of a cost-benefit analysis. Another way to think about it is that too high a level of mitigation may take resources away from adaptation, and in this way lead to more net damages. Again, this is a result that could come out of these models. This is something emblematic for the fund model by Richard Toll et al. So as you saw, there are a few names and a few models in this field that keep coming up, but not really grand innovation. We discussed this yesterday a bit over dinner. Although then there have been attempts for the DICE and RICE model. So DICE, the Nordhaus model, and RICE, its regional sibling, to do AD RICE and AD DICE, so adaptation models, where, again, the net damage function is a combination of an optimal mix of adaptation costs and residual damages. And in AD DICE, this adaptation cost is explicitly represented, what you saw a little bit on the earlier graph. This is largely work by Kelly De Bruyne that some of you may know, and she's done a lot of work in this space. And but basically, to my knowledge, and again, this is open for the room, I'm not an expert in cost-benefit IAMs. It doesn't appear like there's been major innovations in the field recently. But I want to come back to this point of optimal adaptation, because it's not that no one thought about that there might be something off with the notion of optimal adaptation in a global model. So this is, again, Kelly De Bruyne and Rob Delling, another very prominent name in this field, thought about actually implementing some restrictions on adaptation from different scenarios. So a restriction on funding, a restriction on quantity of adaptation, a restriction on excess damage, delayed adaptation, flexibility or rigidity of your policy strategy, or here they called it obsolete scenario, but it refers to effectiveness. So whether adaptation can actually meet the societal goal that you've set out for it to do. They've here played with strong and weak restrictions to then show that actually mitigation level needs to probably increase depending on which assumption or which restriction on adaptation you put in. This is just one of the scenarios that they've tried, but there are a couple of different arrangements. So it's not that the field was completely oblivious to the fact that adaptation might not be optimal, but we still don't really know what this means. You know, what is an optimal level from which we then only to take 50%, or what is the cost of adaptation? If you only value adaptation to your economic assets, might you maybe miss out on adaptation to heat stress or other areas that you might need? And to now show another example for thinking about suboptimal adaptation, I wanted to ask Kai to also present.
Yeah, so very related to this, we made a first step on trying to include adaptation costs into this cost-benefit IAM. And this is quite some old work for a PhD, but it still hasn't been published yet. But it's still under review. That's how it goes. But I just want to give this as an example of a way of thinking of including adaptation in there. So the numbers are not even the most important here, but it's really the way of thinking about it. So what you need basically 3 ingredients. You need some kind of estimate of what the damages are if you don't have any adaptation. That's what they call the gross damage function. So without adaptation. Then you need to know somehow, okay, how high would the adaptation cost be? So if you want to reduce your damages, how much do you have to pay in terms of adaptation? And the third one is, okay, but what are these limits to this adaptation? Okay, it would be great if we could do a lot of adaptation, but like Marina said, there's a lot of these limits to adaptation. And we combined them, and we just took the best values that we could find, which are not great, but at least it's the best what we could find. So for the gross damages, okay, so what are the damages? As I said, we don't know exactly how adaptation was treated in these damage functions, so we just took the high end of the damages, probably an estimate of what the damages would be without adaptation. For the adaptation costs, we are working on it right now, but since that isn't finished, we had to use something that's available in literature that comes from these at-rise functions from Kelly de Bruin, which are from 2010, and that's a long time ago now. So those are very old, these cost functions. But hey, that's the best that we could find. There's some at-which values also, but they're kind of similar. And then there's this adaptation readiness that are developed by Marina. And just a brief word about it, because you might show it later. Or...
I'll show it.
Okay. But basically it says that you can't do optimal adaptation, but there are some limits to adaptation because of some adaptive of socioeconomic situations. And what we then did is we combined all 3, and you can imagine that your damages are larger because you can't do optimal adaptation. If you do optimal adaptation, your damages are relatively low. There's still a limit there. But since you can't do this optimal level of adaptation, your total damages are higher because of these limits that Marina also already told about. And this is quite substantial. So just because of this adaptation limits, you see that the damages, this is how much larger are the damages in your region because of suboptimal adaptation. And you can see that in the kind of scenario dependent, but in an SSP3 world where adaptation is very limited, then your damages are 50% higher than if you could have done optimal adaptation. In a world where in an SSP where you can do more adaptation, so in these narratives of the SSPs, then in SSP1, SSP5, you can do much more adaptation, then these are around 15% higher. So 2 main things here: your damages are much higher because of you can't do optimal adaptation, and your SSP is very important. And we often, as a community, we think, oh, let's just do SSP2 because it's easy and everyone does SSP2. Like the IPCC scenario database has like 90% of SSP2 scenarios, but it's super important if you start thinking about adaptation and impacts. It just has a big effect. And the reason that we started doing this is we wanted to have this RCP SSP matrix, but also for damages. We already have it for mitigation costs. It was there since 10 years. but we wanted to make it for damages as well, and then adaptation becomes important. And as you can see that across the SSPs, for example, for the same RCP, your damages in an SSP1 are much lower than an SSP3. And most of that comes from this reduced level of adaptation that's possible there.
What is the discount rate that you use?
Yeah, we use this is, I think, the average discount rate of 3% per year here, but it does depend on the discount rate.
Average across regions or average?
So we looked at, these are global values, so we looked at the global impacts first, and then these yearly global impacts, we discounted them with one same discount rate of 3%.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Is there the extra damage cost higher for lower RCP values?
Yes, that is actually because a lot of it, so these dashed parts are sea level rise damages. And there, if you have less adaptation there, then your damages become much larger. And in the lower RCP, relatively speaking, sea level rise is a much larger percentage. Mm-hmm. So, but still, this is actually like it's higher than if you compared to the no adaptation, but still the total damages would be much lower than in the high. But that's, yeah, it's a good point. It's a bit misleading here. Yes.
And with this approach, then you don't have straight up between adaptation and mitigation?
No, because we fixed the RCP. You first do a run without impacts, where you just take what are what's your RCP, what's your emission level, and then for that emission level you start calculating your damages and your adaptation, and you still calculate the optimal adaptation level, but there's no trade-off with mitigation because we fixed the mitigation to this RCP here. You can also do a cost-benefit run there, but it becomes just more tricky. Yeah. But I will go back to you then.
Yeah, perhaps also to pick up on this point of underestimating, overestimating damages and the trade-off treatment of mitigation and adaptation, because we're at an equity and justice and equity summer school. To me, this was problematic because I thought you need to do all you can on mitigation and then do adaptation to the residual damage. So treating it from the get-go as a substitute, I thought was problematic from a justice perspective. But of course, the benefits of mitigation and adaptation also operate in different timescales. So in regions that are currently facing most burden, currently and in the future, most burdened by climate change, this would indeed need immediate adaptation because they would see the immediate benefits. So it is a tricky calculation, but it needs to be very carefully designed if it's part of a cost-benefit analysis. Yeah. That's why the paper is not yet published.
So we can have a whole discussion about discount rates. And currently in the literature, 3% is like the default. And IPCC AR6 uses 3% as default. AR5 used 5% as default. But yeah, so this is in total discount rate, right? It's not just pure rate of time, but it's total discount rate. If you think that it usually, well, actually, this is not true. We didn't use 3%. We used 1.5% plus your growth rate, which is SSP dependent. And this 1.5%, that's the kind of the median. So I think the discount rate is different across the SSPs. Don't remember exactly because it's been in review for so long.
Okay, but this thing is going to be huge impact on this.
Yes, but it makes a smaller impact than the application. We look at this.
And maybe that's very important too.
But the SSP5, you have much higher growth rates than SSP3.
There was another question and then we move on. Or, no.
I wanted to ask again about your view on the trade-off nature between our model mitigation and adaptation, because in these very old papers, for all of the problems, it's modeled as a trade-off. But still, the outcome of the whole exercise is that as soon as it's not optimal adaptation, actually including adaptation, raises mitigation ambition. So in the outcome, even though in the model it's a trade, but in the outcome it's not a trade. So
yes, but it's rarely, what is suboptimal? How do you know how is it suboptimal? How is optimality regionally distributed or not?
yeah,
So
but just conceptually thinking, I'm wondering about you that even if you model it as a trade-off, the result is not a trade-off. How you see that tension?
Because pluralism da parte of equilibrium in that sense. So my I'm kind of situation.
I see what you mean. I don't have an answer right away. Okay, let's take another question. Yeah.
No, I would like to explain exactly the same way, like the cases that actually the adaptation strategy in definitions. Okay, because it's my covenant, so it means into public situation and that we can situation.
Yeah.
I'm not going for the variables, so I'm going to make actions.
And also in the international policy arena, I think they're always presented as complements, right? In the Paris Agreement, these are complementary to combat climate change. But I'll move on to kind of try to cover this all. This is just a summary, basically, of what we already discussed. No need to go there. Mathijs already covered basically adaptation and process-based IAMs. I wanted to pick up on this point a little bit on, like, sometimes adaptation is there, but impacts are not there. I think sometimes there are situations when there is what you would actually define as adaptation in the model, but no one calls it adaptation. So like this expansion of desalination or even of cooling is there.
If you have like optimal adaptation, there might not be an impact. So that could
Yeah,
be
exactly.
thinking about it, maybe you're right.
Yeah. So there are individual options to some extent represented, and the two-way relationship means that there's a feedback when energy demand.
Yeah.
Okay. But still that tends to not be connected to the socioeconomic capabilities, which brings me now to the point of adaptive capacity. So summarizing what I've showed earlier, this conventional representation of adaptation is that there is a level of climate risk or of damages that can be shaved off by adaptation. So there is some potential of adaptation to reduce your risks. What you see here on this figure as well is that this adaptation potential decreases the higher you go with warming. This is another IPCC insight, basically synthesizing evidence that adaptation becomes less effective. And this is particularly true for adaptation to biophysical impacts like crop yield losses, or think about irrigation. You can only irrigate to a certain level, or even human bodies arguably have a biophysical limit to external stressors. Again, this stylized representation assumes unconstrained or unconditional adaptation. And meanwhile, we know that this adaptation potential is a function of different socioeconomic constraints and enablers to adaptation. Do you want to join?
Just want to get a card.
Oh yeah, good.
I thought we could do a joint moment. And these constraints and enablers to adaptation could be financial, could be broader macroeconomic, could be institutional. Really important institutions as a constraint to adaptation is something that's present in all world regions and almost in all sectors. At least that's what the IPCC finds. There are information constraints. Do you have early warning systems? Can you even access information about adaptation? There are human capacity constraints and sort of more sociocultural constraints that we'll touch upon later. And no surprise there, these constraints and enablers, which could also be jointly termed adaptive capacity, so factors that determine whether you can implement adaptation in the first place, are of course very unequally distributed around the world, which kind of again highlights this equity dimension of course, it applies for mitigation as well. Capacities to mitigate are also very different around the world, and that's a different discussion that surely we'll have throughout the week. But for adaptation, we roughly know where they are and what they are. So if you account for these, suddenly this potential for adaptation maybe halves, or maybe in some regions this disappears altogether, or looks very different. Maybe you cannot do transformative adaptation action, but only really incremental changes that only get you so far. So you will actually reach different limits, be it that stem from socioeconomic characteristics earlier. Bottom line, which you by now all understood, models do not incorporate the extent to which societies can adapt, and particularly from an equity perspective, this is hugely problematic. And to make conclusions about even climate finance, allocation of finance, this is something that we really should find out, because climate impacts are not waiting for us to figure out their models. The proposal that has come out from my PhD work mostly is to try to integrate quantified adaptive capacity into global models. But then, of course, this raises the question of how do you measure adaptive capacity? And there are lots of different proposals out there. But actually, when you review these papers, it really boils down to several higher order dimensions around economic and financial capital, around human capital, around institutions, and perhaps some also sociocultural factors. So yes, adaptation is contextual, but this, for some of you from development economics background, this might remind you of the capability theory of Amartya Sen. I don't need to know what exactly is right for each particular locality in terms of adaptation, but if I know roughly their macroeconomic characteristics, I could be somewhat confident that they will be able to do what's best for them. So this would be a way to, in a generalized way, represent basically ability to adapt without knowing every single adaptation option that typically is the first criticism that you hear when you try to model adaptation. It's context specific. Yes, it is context specific, but perhaps we could say something in general about sort of higher order characteristics of the different localities. There's been quite some literature, also like index-based assessments, but no projections to date. So basically, first I'll show this, to show again how the distribution of these constraints varies around the world. I mean, I already said things like institutions are a constraint to adaptation in all world regions, and finance almost everywhere except for Europe, where it's classified as a medium constraint. And then you still have human capacity, information, awareness, technology, economic, social, cultural factors. And if you're familiar with the SSP scenarios, you might know that actually we're able to represent most of these dimensions in the scenario space. And those that we didn't have before, I wrote some PhD papers on this to complement this set, to actually be able to say that we can assess all dimensions of adaptive capacity found and identified by the IPCC in the scenario space. So take a look at these indicators. For example, so if you look at GDP, urbanization, population size, age structure, education, mean years of schooling, migration flows, gender gap in mean years of schooling, these are elements of the key drivers of the SSPs. I don't know how familiar are you with SSPs? Roughly, I guess everyone's had some,
80% of people are working with IAMs or so. So like most of the people are reached by an IMC emails. I think most people should probably know.
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of.
If there's nobody that doesn't know the SSPs, can he or she raise a hand?
No shame.
Yeah, no shame.
Too late.
Basically,
In that case, we should have prepared.
It's not even so important. I want to say, like, there are key drivers to the SSPs: GDP, population, and urbanization. And there were indicators developed sort of from the onset. And then there have been numerous extensions to the SSP framework, which are basically internally consistent projections for the different indicators. So structural change, that refers to how does sectoral structure of economies change over time between agriculture, service, and industry. Extreme poverty was another indicator, very important for adaptation. Income inequality as well, that came after. Remittances, this is showing to be hugely important for countries that especially are hit by extreme events, can sometimes only recover if they have remittances coming from abroad, because access to capital is otherwise very expensive. My work is centered around these indicators of governance and institutions, coming from, so motivated by this fact that this is the #1 barrier around the world. And these extensions here are largely based on the World Bank indicators of governance, which have limitations to them. And now we're trying to also expand this portfolio of governance indicators to indicators that political scientists like a bit more. For human capacity and information, we also have quite a bit at disposal, actually, to assess different demographic and human capital dimensions. And then finally, for what's the trickiest to assess, the sociocultural component, and arguably very limited, still remains in the current framework. But I will talk about this tomorrow. I developed projections of a gender inequality index, because for adaptation, it's hugely important if half of your population doesn't have same access to resources as the other half, and meanwhile has the same pressure to adapt. But more on this, I think, a bit tomorrow. So, yeah. No, I think this would be.
I think you can increase your capacity to adapt to those impacts.
Right. I think we think about it in a slightly different way, and maybe that's what I should have started with. So I think what you're describing, I think of as vulnerability, so susceptibility to hazards, and this would be almost the flip side. I think they're correlated, but not necessarily. They're not necessarily the same. So capacity would really describe your abilities to take action, and it wouldn't necessarily be dependent on natural resources sensitivity.
Yes, it's because I'm saying from agriculture, especially when you have forests, and then what you were mentioning about irrigation, crop-fields, and all of this, if you have water, you can irrigate, otherwise you're very basins, you cannot. Or
okay. I got it. Yes. No, okay, I get it now. No, I think that's 100% right. And I think even in the IPCC, there would be also a biophysical, I think this would belong to sort of the biophysical characteristics. And I'll speak about this a little bit later when I showed this desalination example, because we had to take into account water availability sort of in the first place, is almost like this was more about really socioeconomic characteristics. But thanks for bringing that up. This was just showing the same. Okay, and now I wanted to show implementation of this logic, not strictly in the model, but combining different model products to say something about cooling gap. And the cooling gap is basically the difference between population exposed to heat stress and with access to air conditioning. Yes. Yeah.
And the system which is very unified in one way, because you don't have the alternative to switch to. So coming from agriculture, different crops, but also in economic terms, if you have more economic actors who have much more capacity to switch to different company supply or whatever, And if you have something.
Yeah, I mean, all good examples. This is not meant to be an exhaustive set. This is meant to show that we can, so all of these dimensions identified by the IPCC, we have at least one indicator to say something about them, but it's not at all meant to say that's now a complete list or enough. So if you would have a good idea for how to capture this and how to characterize this in the different SSPs, I think this could be quite a nice contribution, especially for models that don't necessarily have a big sectoral resolution. So I think this flexibility of, well, diversification of livelihoods, right? Like that's a big thing for adaptation. So if you're a farmer, can you just simply switch to then run a hotel or become a nurse? Or like, what is your ability to switch livelihoods on an individual level? And I guess you could say something about this on a macro level too.
I mean, I guess diversity of needs to be everything. Like, it could be on household level, if it used to be on an economic level, you have very strong, like monopolist, like companies who dominate the value. Then this reduces the capacity. They might just increase it because somebody for them, should be expect this question. I don't know. Didn't hear that, but I think it's structurally different because those one are more like think like they're specific to like, for example, economic or governance institutions like indicators, but this one's like the diversity or redundancy is very system, like they're all system level and online system.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, that sounds good. I wouldn't have an idea of how to quantify this necessarily with something like an indicator, because that's ultimately what you would need. Or, I mean, what we're also trying to say is that it will be really important to couple this information with qualitative insights. So to somehow constrain this, for example, the level of diversity of your economy.
I understand that these scenarios. My question is, how do you integrate these indicators with the combine? Especially I'm interested in like governance institutions, social economic, social cultural indicators. How are you integrating them?
Yeah, I think I'm coming to that a little bit. So I think we definitely didn't do big high-level integration. I mean, Kai, to some extent, what he showed was now a composite of some of these indicators. There's an indicator called adaptation readiness, basically, which characterizes your ability to leverage investment. So how, what is your fiscal state to now implement adaptation options? So this was like a bit more, composite way of basically doing exactly this. So you would constrain the level of adaptation that you can do with an indicator. But I think this might clarify in my next slides. So I wanted to talk about this cooling gap example. This is also building on shoulders of other work in this field, including Detlef. So basically, the problem here is that there is an adaptation gap. And I think adaptation gap is a very practical way of thinking about this question, because then if you have a gap, then you probably know that would be a way to close this gap. And that's something that's very nice to assess with scenarios. So the problem here is heat stress exposure, here simply represented as a share of population on the country level that's exposed to heat stress. Here, minus people with access to air conditioning, again, quite unequal around the world. What you get when you subtract exposure minus air conditioning ownership in very simple terms is this adaptation gap. So population exposed to heat stress without access to air conditioning. And we wanted to see how will this change in the future. So climate impacts from heat will change, but how will the socioeconomics change? So for this, basically, we got some historical data on air conditioning uptake, and we analyzed this very, rather simply statistically, and tried to explain the uptake of air conditioning with a set of these adaptive capacity indicators. And what we found here is that air conditioning uptake is explained by GDP per capita, urbanization, and income inequality. So the more money you have, the more air conditioning, the more urban areas, the more air conditioning, the less income inequality, the more air conditioning. All made sense. This was quite a neat model. Not all adaptation options are measurable like this, so we definitely here harvested some low-hanging fruits. And combining all of this information then allows us to say something about how these, well, how this adaptation gap, but ultimately it's really risk of climate change will change for different regions over time. So basically here I really love this figure for how immediately it tells you where is adaptive capacity crucial, where does it make a huge difference? And also from an equity perspective, you see for regions of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So for the same RCP, it makes a massive difference for how many people are exposed already in mid-century and especially later. Depends so much on which SSP you're in. So how high is your adaptive capacity? So this now could be fed back into the model if you want to estimate energy demand. So cooling, we understand quite well. Almost all models can implement, or almost all, but I'm not sure. Yeah, can implement cooling. We did a similar study for irrigation. Basically, with this logic, like irrigation, you can also measure. So we also implemented this logic. I think irrigation was a function of money and governance. But basically, I was hoping that this would get a bit of a pickup so that we would identify several sort of high-level or easily identifiable adaptation options and quantify it further. I know this work has taken up to also add not just air conditioning, but also like ventilators or like fans or like other ways to adapt, because it's not just air conditioning. It doesn't mean if you don't have air conditioning, you'll that's it. But it's sort of a very powerful and easily measurable option. I wanted to mention a little bit what we're doing here in the PRISMA project. Mathijs mentioned maladaptation, so we're acting as though we've solved adaptation, so we can now think about maladaptation. So what are the feedbacks with adaptation, not only on energy demand, I guess, or on emissions? I guess that's an obvious one that you really want to assess this carefully. But another one also is that with another problem with maladaptation is that adapting to water stress upstream can cause problems downstream. It can shift vulnerabilities in this way. It can produce other environmental problems like desalination, creates a lot of this brine material, which is environmentally very hazardous, and so on. So there are different ways to think about maladaptation. This is a very thriving field of research, I would say, and we're looking at it from a rather engineering perspective. I mean, still looking at what you can quantify. So in PRISMA, we're looking at specifically my team at IASA, we're looking at desalination and at wastewater treatment. And technology used in agriculture, that's not what we're looking at. I think this got a bit lost on the slide.
Okay, I don't know who made the slide. It's
never mind.
Desalination, that would be not sure. Not sure.
So basically, that's another thing that we can represent in IAMs. And here you can see some preliminary projections, also preliminary for quite some time now. My fault. Basically, here we use the similar logic of, and with desalination, it's really nice because we have, when things are commercial, like desalination, there's a lot of money in it. Then you can also have really nice data sets, and they go back to 1960 and with reliable data probably from 1980. So we have really nice time series to say something that we're more confident about how desalination has been growing over time. And basically, we've here estimated the cumulative capacity with this equation on top. So this was a panel data set that we had, and not as clear of a story emerges as in the case of cooling, and I won't go into regional details too much. I'm also not 100% confident in them, but basically I just wanted to show it as an example of what we can do now as a step towards model integration, because this would be fed back into the model to primarily estimate energy demand and emissions from adaptation. Yeah, this was basically a summary slide for model integration. So first, climate impact models could use these scenario-specific and time-varying adaptive capacity to parameterize adaptation-relevant inputs so that they're no longer non or maximum, non or optimal, but actually that there is a bit more nuance that's tied to your socioeconomic characteristics. These are some examples of model inputs, but I think we've even said more here now through this conversation. And IAMs would do this either as part of integrating impacts. So your impacts already have built in the notion of adaptive capacity into their estimations. So you get more robust impact assessments. It's something that you could potentially compare with mitigation scenarios. And in an ideal world, we would have a very integrated way of looking at adaptation and mitigation pathways together, but I think we're not there yet. And I will show now a bit of a frontier, and with this I will also end. So you're all familiar with adaptation pathway, with mitigation pathways, but there has been also development in the adaptation literature on adaptation pathways, and namely dynamic adaptation pathways. This is really being championed in the Netherlands, and no surprise. I mean, high adaptation pressure and a lot of money. What do you get? Great science and adaptation. So I always love coming here to learn what's new. But again, yeah, okay, let's come to that later. Basically, it looks something like this. I mean, these are really tools also targeted to policymakers. You'll sit down with them and derive an adaptation goal, kind of jointly with different interest holders, ideally. And you would look at what your uncertainties are and what the options for adaptation are, and you would sequence these adaptation options over time. That's what you see here. It looks a little bit like a metro map. And at certain points in time, either due to changing climatic conditions or changing socioeconomic conditions, you might reach adaptation tipping points. So the need to switch from one option to another, or you might end up in a lock-in if you didn't do this planning on time. An example of this, again, found its way into the IPCC report. So here you see it present in the Europe chapter for, yes, I chose, again, the example of health. There are examples for several other sectors as well. Basically, how you could, these are illustrative examples for South and, do you see it somewhere? I think it's different regions, Northern and Southern Europe. Yeah, sorry. Basically showing in relation to expected risks of heat stress, what you could do. So here are several adaptation options: heat-proof land development, air conditioning, building interventions, and ultimately behavioral change. Here you see growing level of warming, and basically here are ways to combine these options, to sequence them, and ultimately the idea would be that you build a resilient system or a resilient society. What I'm interested in right now and working with, so Marjolein Hasnoot, who's kind of one of the pioneers of development of pathways, also here a professor in Utrecht, working actively with her to kind of say something about adaptation pathways that are embedded in scenarios. So the Netherlands can develop very fancy adaptation pathways with lots of different options, lots of ways to switch, to combine options. But what if we're talking about a different scenario and a different climate pressure and also a different adaptation philosophy? So basically what we're trying to say here is that, yes, in an SSB 1.9 world, so not very high climate pressures and a lot of socioeconomic capacity, you may have a very elaborate adaptation pathway map. But if the space is constrained either by socioeconomics or by climate pressures or by the combination of two, your solution space simply shrinks. And it shrinks even further if you're in an SSB 6.0 world. So this is so far still conceptual thinking. We need to do a lot more both modeling and empirical work to understand how this would really be quantified and ultimately operationalized in the model. So it's a bit of a long run project, but I wanted to show here that we're really trying to go beyond a single option. So like what I showed for cooling, but towards a portfolio of options that are combinable, but that are still embedded in your socioeconomic characteristics and the climate world. The hope with all of this, and I think this is also where I'll end, is that we no longer represent risk as these single burning embers at different points in time, but that we have a more dynamic representation of risk where we would actually see for a given region or globally how it really changes year to year and which portion of this risk can actually be reduced by adaptation in this case. So I tried to here visualize that in an SSB1 world, probably maybe half of the risk in illustrative terms could be reduced because you have strong adaptive capacity, but in an SSB3 world, perhaps only really a small portion and only in some parts of the world could be reduced. And this changes the math and ultimately implications for loss and damage. So another key aspect in the equity debate is how much loss and damage is projected and where, and if there are limits to adaptation. So basically loss and damage occurs after you've hit limits to adaptation. And can we analyze and identify where do these limits to adaptation occur based on your adaptive capacity in the combination with climatic pressures. You have a bit of a summary here that I don't need to repeat. I guess you'll have access to the slides. I listed here a few equity relevant research questions that I kind of kept thinking about while also thinking about this presentation, but I think that's come up in our conversation as well. And here you'll also find a selection of some useful reading, but there is more to it as well. Now I'd be, of course, happy for questions, but I'd also be curious to learn about who's already working on adaptation or trying to integrate it or not at all. I've talked to some of you yesterday, and yeah, generally how you think about it, because as you saw today, there are many different ways also to think about adaptation.
First of all, yeah, that's good probably to have two very important questions or so. We also have to break now. You were a bit later, started a bit later. But there's probably ample opportunity also to discuss this further. But if there are a few important things to share, that's good to have it now. I just want to say it's great that you are both here. I think with both you and Kai, we have really people at the forefront of impacts and adaptation, especially related to models. So in that sense, I thought it was a great morning already. But let's a great start. Great, start of today. Question? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like transformative adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah.
In which sense transformation, Jamie?
So I'm working on resilience, and they're usually define like buffer and then adaptation and transformation. Right.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there's any idea of like trying to understand how the system might be able to transform itself to a better state instead of just being like adaptive would be like right, you just adapt to whatever is there, but transformative would be like they're trying to make this place better. Is there any ideas about that?
So basically, what I didn't spend any time mentioning here, this transformative, incremental, fragmented, is a way, and that's work of my colleagues. I'm not so in this scholarship, but we're basically trying to also say that transformation for the better is much easier in a wealthier and a world with less climate pressures. I mean, that's very simple to say. While in an SSB2 world, and also the scenario itself is characterized as sort of continuation of the current trends, which is where we would expect to see more incremental changes. So what we're trying to do now is build into the SSB narrative specifically this like potential for transformation, or in this case, just transformational adaptation. What I find challenging here is to define this sort of from a top-down level, which is what kind of tends to happen in scenario framing. how do we define transformative adaptation globally? That would be very difficult. So we're leaving it sort of vague and with the hope that this types of approaches would be taken up on a more local level where this would indeed be possible to define. But I think that's a great point. Yeah, and here we call it, in the SSP-RCP framework, you have the SPAs, right? The shared policy assumption, in which this could be weaved in. Sort of, what is your overall adaptation policy? Is it more transformative, or are you just going to get everyone to install air conditioning? Which is transformative in a different way, I guess. But basically, yes, people are thinking about this and about ways to characterize this.
Culture to, I don't know, propane and then organic production. You there have the transformative adaptation measure, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Even through soils and stuff like that. So I think it's key in these adaptation discussions to discuss who's adapting to what, how, and where. So for example, if we're talking about a farm, that's like a thing. But then if you see the country's production of a crop, maybe that's not transformative. So yeah, I think in agriculture we have it a little bit easier because we have these also definitions born in present with math by like our adaptation is defined more like supply demand. So we have this autonomous adaptation happening, which could be transformative or not, depending on how you see it and how you define your limits.
Last question, maybe?
Yeah. I'm wondering about what the modeling, what they think and nature-based solutions, because like how you are Beijing.
Yeah, I don't know how. I absolutely don't know how, but that's a very important point that we're bringing in this conversation. Basically, that in this scenario combination, you can probably forget about nature-based solutions because you just have too high levels of climate change and you're just like exhausted the biophysical limits of nature, the biophysical potential of nature-based solutions. So I think this would be a really nice line of work to highlight basically under which conditions do you still have nature-based solutions available? Because probably from the effectiveness perspective, so effectiveness of nature-based solution to do adaptation options is tightly linked with the level of warming. And I think this would be really nice to explore systematically. I'm sure some work has been done, but.
Great, thanks again.
Thank you.
I would propose to reconvene like at 35 past, so 5 past, that's okay. There's coffee next door. I know that if one or two people had some trouble with sort of following your instructions. I don't want to kill your break, but maybe you have some tips for like for a few people.
Yeah,
then
so,
just go to Kai or
yeah, just come to me.
Yeah.
If there were problems.
But enjoy your coffee. So see you later. Thanks.
Quite excited to combine remote work with the projects that they application customers. Yeah.